I hope you enjoy this crossover episode of the AI Engineering Podcast, which is another show that I run to act as your guide to the fast moving world of building scalable and maintainable AI systems. As generative AI models have grown more powerful and are being applied to a broader range of use cases, the lines between data and AI engineering are becoming increasingly blurry. The responsibilities of data teams are being extended into the realm of context engineering, as well as designing and supporting new infrastructure elements that serve the needs of agentic applications. This episode is an example of the types of work that are not easily categorized into one or the other camp. Hello, and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. Data teams everywhere face the same problem. They're forcing ML models, streaming data, and real-time processing through orchestration tools built for simple ETL. The result? Inflexible infrastructure that can't adapt to different workloads. That's why Cash App and Cisco rely on Prefect. Cash App's fraud detection team got what they needed: flexible compute options, isolated environments for custom packages, and seamless data exchange between workflows. Each model runs on the right infrastructure, whether that's high-memory machines or distributed compute. Orchestration is the foundation that determines whether your data team ships or struggles. ETL, ML model training, AI engineering, streaming, Prefect runs it all from ingestion to activation in one platform. Whoop and 1Password also trust Prefect for their data operations. If these industry leaders use Prefect for critical workloads, see what it can do for you at dataengineeringpodcast.com/prefect. Composable data infrastructure is great until you spend all of your time gluing it back together. Bruin is an open source framework driven from the command line that makes integration a breeze. Write Python and SQL to handle the business logic, and let Bruin handle the heavy lifting of data movement, lineage tracking, data quality monitoring, and governance enforcement. Bruin allows you to build end-to-end data workflows using AI, has connectors for hundreds of platforms, and helps data teams deliver faster. Teams that use Bruin need less engineering effort to process data and benefit from a fully integrated data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Bruin today to get started. And for dbt Cloud customers, they'll give you a $1,000 credit to migrate to Bruin Cloud. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm welcoming back Max Beauchemin to talk about the impact of multiplayer, multi-agent engineering on the individual and team velocity for building better data and AI systems. So, Max, for anybody who's not familiar, can you give a quick introduction?
Yeah, I'll do a quick intro. So I've been on the show maybe 5 or 6 times, maybe more. So I've done a lot of work in data engineering in the past. So I started at Apache Airflow in 2014. Probably Airflow doesn't need much of an introduction anymore. It's used everywhere pretty much. And then over the past decade, I've been working on Apache Superset. That's a data visualization exploration platform that's fully open source. That's in the space of business intelligence. So like trying to push Tableau and Looker and these like proprietary software solution out of the way and displace with open source. Superset has gotten really, really good over the past few years or so. It's a super great app. So if you haven't checked it out, I would recommend you check it out and you stop using proprietary software for data visualization, data consumption. What else? Yeah, maybe I'll say a thing or two. Since the beginning of the year, I mean, I've been adopting AI since, GPT 3.5 came out, but over the past, I'd say 6 to 9 months, like really onboarded on Claude Code and Codex and all the agentic coding solution, and been really thinking about how to parallelize as many agents as possible. So these agents got so good and they're getting better. So since I would say April or May, that's when I discovered Claude Code. I had like just enlightenment, hit me, and I was like, okay, how do we really squeeze the juice out of this super amazing technology? Realized very quickly that the world of software engineering was going to change very, very quickly, and onboarded hard. And since then, I've been pretty much trying to figure out how to get more and more agents to do really great software engineering. So how do you team up with agents? How do you team up, work as a team with agents? And at Preset, so I started a company 5 or 6 years ago, and at Preset, we onboarded hard on Claude Code. So everyone got an Anthropic Pro Max plan, and we've been really reshaping the way that we work internally as a team to really get as much of a boost from these AI coding agents as much as possible.
And for the day-to-day usage of these AI engineering agents, what are some of the typical types of tasks or workloads that you're farming out to them? And what is your heuristic for when you want to keep something for a human operator to actually maintain versus handing it off to the AI?
Pretty much everything. So, as a founder, you get to do a lot of things, like, including like legal operations, and of course, some product development is the main focus and the main thing. But I would say since GPT 3.5 and more so over time, like I developed a AI first reflex for just about everything. Excuse me. So the bulk of what I do, I try to do with an AI, and then more and more, I just fire up, Cloud Code or Codex for, I would say, 95% of what I'm doing, including operations type work, including legal, research, planning, preparing talks, writing blogs. So I've been pretty much using for everything. I would say the thing that's kind of left to me and that, remains kind of my control plane would be like orchestrating agents, really. So that really I see my role more and more as, orchestrating agents. And of course, there's the people component, manage a team and want to grow, foster like leaders, inside the company. So that's much more of a human thing. But since the get-go, I've been pushing everyone to use, AI at everything it's good at, pretty much, and it can really accelerate, multiply efficiency across the board. So I've been pretty radical on using AI myself and pushing others to do so as well.
Yeah, one of the common themes that I've been seeing from the various blog posts and communications of other folks in the space is that the thing that is going to remain distinctly human is being sort of the tastemaker, the person who has opinions about things versus the person who's actually doing the execution. And one of the other interesting aspects that I've seen is that at a certain point, there are only so many agents that you can manage just in terms of your own cognitive overhead, where you're trying to keep track of what are all the different things that they're doing. And I'm curious what you're seeing as you do accelerate more of the actual execution phase, how that changes where the bottlenecks show up in your own work and in your team.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and that's been shifting quite a bit as people adapt their workflow. I wrote a blog over the weekend around how AI is changing software engineering, and really see the future going towards agent orchestration, and started building a tool that we'll probably talk about in this episode around like tooling to make it easier for you to stay sane while managing a lot of agents, and also allowing you to collaborate with your team. So bring an army of agents, but also bring your team to share AI sessions and Git worktrees, and potentially like dev environments too. So kind of bringing back dev environments to the early Unix days where multiple people work on the same box so they can share a development environment that's live. But the bottlenecks have shifted very, very quickly, right? So if people report being multiplied by AI by different degrees. Some people will say like, I'm 20% faster, I'm slower. Personally, like since the get-go, I've been like 2, 5, 10x, like somewhere I would say between 2x and 10x on coding specifically, or, the act of, designing and shipping software. Some of the areas that are still that are kind of becoming a traffic jam now are, code review for sure, QA, right? So you still need to go in your app, though you can get a lot of help from the agents to write good unit tests and integration tests, or even like Playwright MCP, which is super great. If you haven't tried it, you should try it. But Playwright MCP is like browser type automation. So agents can go in your app, look at the console, take screenshots, use multi-modality while using your app. So I would say everything is accelerated, even the areas that are more bottlenecky now, like the code review. Like agents are great at code review. Now I don't push a PR without having Codex 5.1 that's out. I've been out for a week now, but I'm using Codex to do first check, first round of review on most of my Claude Code emitted code. So I think all these areas can also be accelerated by AI, but I would say the real traffic jam is around like async workloads, right? So if you code 10 times faster, there's a lot of PRs out, and you probably need people to come review your code depending on your internal policy. There's an interesting question. I'm thinking more now that can we just say that the AI wrote the code and I'm the reviewer, so I don't need to bring another human, at least for some PRs. So being able to elect to say, like, listen, the AI wrote the code, I'm the reviewer, I don't need another human in the loop, that can probably greatly accelerate things. So that bottleneck of, you ask for code review, what's the mean time to first review, right? 24 hours, 48 hours. Like if you're in a very dynamic organization that has shifted their workflow to it because of AI, maybe you can get review the same day, but that workflow is just like, now your context, your own personal human context evaporates, right? And then someone else has to build up that context to do code review. And then it's been 48 hours and you get back in that AI session. If you still have that CLI open, right? If you kind of saved it in a tmux window with the work tree with the Docker environment, maybe you can get back to it, or maybe you have to fire up a new session and load up the context in your brain inside the AI's context window. So that, I would say, is really the thing that I'm trying to, or one of the things, I'm trying to address with the agent orchestration tooling I'm building right now.
One of the other interesting aspects of these agentic capabilities that I found as I was going through that adoption curve is that at the outset, there's a little bit of uncertainty as to what you can use it for because you haven't started to explore their boundaries, and you don't necessarily have the workflow set up for being able to easily give the agents the appropriate context, or you don't necessarily have all the tools available that make it easy for the agent to validate the changes that it's making. And I'm curious how you're using some of that adoption curve of using these agentic engineering processes to build the tools that are necessary to further accelerate the agentic use cases.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? You hear from some people how they try AI at something and it didn't work, and therefore AI is bad at X, right? But I think those boundaries are shifting really fast. So if you think about the horizon of what AI can do well, or what that AI can do well, that's shifting very, very quickly. So you need to like keep testing the boundaries. So maybe AI was not good at using a browser automation to run some tests like last time you tried 3 months ago. But now there's Playwright MCP, there's like Cloud Code's got better, or the latest version of the models got better multimodality. The tooling has improved. So I think you need to constantly revisit the boundaries that you found in previous experiment. So it's not because it didn't work a month ago or 3 months ago that it won't work now. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, in terms of, if you have this AI first reflex, there's no question of whether you're going to use AI or not. So it's like, how do I get an AI the right context to help me accomplish this task, right? So there for sure, maybe the first reflex, you're working on a new repo, assuming you're working on software engineering, fire up Cloud Code, run /init, and you get a cloud.md, in that repo. Maybe you install the GHAs on that repo to have something like Cloud Code or Codex review. So you can add Claude, can you review this PR first? And then maybe you start building a little context folder with context nuggets that are useful for the task at hand and might be reusable or useful in future AI tasks. So that's one thing, I think the first reflex was to create a Claude.md and cram more and more stuff into it. That doesn't scale, right? Like you cannot just have like one context file. So on our side, what we discovered is we're starting to have a context folder in all of our repo where we keep what I call context nuggets, but just markdown files that are generally less than 500 line of documentation that can be retrieved for a different task, right? So if you're getting an agent to write unit tests, then you fire up your front end, or you bring in context, your front end convention, maybe your testing guidelines, right? So if you have this portfolio of context nuggets, then it becomes pretty easy for you to retrieve the context that's required, and just that, right? Not just like vomit the context over the context window, but just like pick the things that are going to be useful. So our Cloud Code or agents.md at preset has become more and more just a glossary of these context nuggets. So treating context as code is like, the first thing to do probably. So that's definitely an important thing to do early on and systematically now.
And I think, too, in the data context, it becomes particularly interesting as far as that context engineering challenge of how do you wire in the tools for the agent to be able to understand the overall organizational context and the system context for what data is being processed, how it needs to be transformed, because the data itself is going to immediately blow up your context window. So how do you determine what are the appropriate pieces of metadata? How do you structure that metadata effectively? How do you wire that into various MCP tools or whatever other command line utilities you want to pass to the agent to be able to have it help you effectively identify issues with your pipelines or design new pipelines or manage your overall warehouse schema, particularly if you're talking about enterprise scale, just because just the schema itself, just not even with any of the data, that could easily explode your context window. So I'm curious how you're seeing teams use some of these agentic coding practices in that context of the data ecosystem, where even just the metadata can be too large for the agent to be able to properly encompass.
Right. So there's, maybe different categories of context if you think about it, or maybe one way to segment this idea of context is like the context that can be retrieved just in time, right? So if you need to get sample data or retrieve a schema, do you need to put that in a markdown file or in documentation? Probably not, right? Because your agent's got access to dbt run or dbt, like the various dbt command if you're working in dbt or the airflow CLI. So MCP here is probably a much better construct, or having the right CLIs. So I haven't done a whole lot of agentic coding in the data engineering space. I've been mostly working on Apache Superset, on Agor itself that we'll talk about in a minute. So I've been doing more software engineering with AI, but I've got like anecdotal evidence, maybe like call it a dozen or so tasks that I did on our data warehouse, mostly DBT stuff. And my Claude.md doesn't have my schema or my data in there, right? I just give the CLI, or I just give the agentic coding. I tell it that it has access to SQL. So we have a little nifty like superset CLI where you can run arbitrary SQL. So you provide the tool to the agent to run arbitrary SQL, and just with that, I can use information schema to tables, information schema to columns. If it wants to know what are the percentage of null or the value or statistics, it can just run an on-the-fly query. So definitely would refrain from building context documents that are duplicative of what the agent can retrieve just in time, from the database itself or from the tooling itself. So in data, I haven't seen like the state of MCP in the data space, but there's some really good CLI. So you just auth your CLI and you let the AI know like, hey, I've got this SQL running thing, or you can use the BigQuery, Google Cloud CLI to run arbitrary SQL. And you can run dbt run, you can run the Airflow CLI. It's all set up for you. Just go and fetch the context you need as you go. And that was, really the big breakthrough with Claude Code. Instead of having to copy paste or prepare context or do prompt engineering of fetching the context that you need for the task, now the agent just has the tools to go fetch it. So just rely on that. That's where the magic truly happens here. So then what does belong in context, right? At that point. So say for data engineering, I would say the things that are tribal knowledge that are not stamped in the database or in the data, right? So things like your high level data flow diagram of like, where does this Airflow job fits in my bigger data flow diagram for my company, or things that are external to the repository, like business logic and things like that. So things that are not accessible to the agent, but valuable for the execution of tasks you want the AI to perform for you. Those are the things you want to, curate in context and treat context as code as much as possible. I'll say one more thing, which is there's a lot of like information that is specific to your repo and you can store it all in your repo, but there's a lot of things that might exist in other repos or in Notion or in that are, call it institutional knowledge. And that I'm unclear, exactly where you put that, but you could imagine that you would have some sort of like knowledge repository, somewhere that your agents would be given access to. I think there's some work in that space of like, trying to get all your institutional knowledge in some sort of like knowledge base that you can, rag with your agents. We haven't really hit that too much. Now for us at Preset, I would say most tasks are within the scope of a repository and usually don't require things that are external to that, or the user, can kind of pass it in the context of the task in there, as they craft their PRD or their design doc for the task at hand.
Yeah, in particular for me, over the past few weeks, I found it extremely helpful to be able to tell the GitHub Copilot CLI, you have access to kube control and Helm to help me diagnose this problem. And it rapidly accelerates the time to resolution for determining what bugs I've just introduced in my infrastructure as code or understanding why a particular service is behaving in a certain way. And yeah, the just-in-time retrieval and hydration of context is absolutely game-changing when you are able to wire those tools in. Of course, that also brings in a lot of considerations around security and access control and what tools do you want to give to the agent in the event that it makes the wrong choice. And so making sure that you're properly supervising exactly which commands it's running when it's potentially going to be manipulating state that will impact other people.
Yeah, so sandboxing becomes really important, right? Especially if you want to run, the agents will get naggy and it will ask for a lot of permission. It's really tempting to bypass the permission. So you can, go fix yourself a coffee while the agent is cooking. But yeah, in my case, I run a lot of these agents in Docker with like limited damage they can inflict, to an environment. I think that's somewhat important in terms of, yeah, you're right about the like giving access to the agent to the tools that you would use to do the work, right? Whether it's a kubectl or the GH CLI to interact with GitHub, or these agents do so well with Git GH. They do so well with things like, yeah, you give it a CLI that can run SQL and it will just like go to town with this thing. So give it access to the tools. I think like there's also this like DevX idea. I've been thinking maybe like 3 or 4 months ago, I was thinking a lot about DevX and AIX, I call it. So call it DevX for AI. So if you have really good DevX and it's really easy to run a unit test in your repo or fire up a Docker environment, right? You have really good Docker Compose, you have really good infrastructure to run, single command to run, unit tests, integration tests, fire up a Docker, clear a volume on Docker. You give that to the agent, it's going to do so much better than if you have like really convoluted type, DevX. So I think DevX becomes much more important. So as coding, instead of coding becoming like 90% of the time you spent, now if that goes like 5 to 10x faster, then you end up spending a lot more time like firing up environment, pulling branches, and running that one unit. Like whatever is glitchy is gonna become apparent really really quickly. So like DevX I think becomes much more environment now that we're coding 10 times faster. I had this interesting analogy I've used before, which is like if you had a car that could go to like a 10,000 miles per hour, but there was like some 10 miles per hour speed limit zone, somewhere in the world, you would spend all of your time seemingly in 10 miles per hour zone, right? So you end up like, because you're going so fast elsewhere, you really, really, really feel the speed bump. So I think that becomes important to figure out how to remove these zones or bypass them altogether, right? So if that zone is where you end up spending the bulk of your time, like let's fix that zone or let's find a detour around this new kind of bottleneck area.
And I think that transitions us well to what you're building with Agor as far as being able to run more of these systems in parallel and be able to monitor them and keep them occupied without having to worry about, oh, I've got 2 different terminal sessions open. And now that I've got these 2 different agents, they're starting to conflict with each other's changes, where I know you could use Git worktrees to address some of that, but it also speaks to the need to have very well engineered developer environments where you can easily spin up copies of them and have all of the dependencies necessary, have all of the context necessary, have all of the tools necessary for the agent to be able to actually execute, especially if you want them to be able to run when you close your laptop or and then come back to it. I'm just wondering if you can talk to what were the motivating factors that led you to decide that you actually needed to build a new utility to facilitate that and some of the core requirements and use cases that you were trying to address.
Yes, I would say it's going to be a little difficult to talk about Agor. So Agor is a new tool. I would call it an agent orchestration platform. So it kind of relates to like Airflow is like data pipeline orchestration, but this is very much like agent orchestration platform. And I would say the main problem that it's after is this idea of like, I want to work with a lot of agents. I want to put an army of agents to work and do that effectively, efficiently, without without losing my mind, right? So the place where it came from is, using tmux and Docker and Git worktrees, so I started doing that. I discovered, I think, Git worktrees. I'd heard of them, but I was like, oh man, I need this stuff. Now that I'm cloning the same repo 5 or 6 times to work on five or six features at a time. Found Git worktrees probably in May or so, and then redid a lot of our DevX stuff in supersets, specifically to be able to run multiple superset environments in Docker without them conflicting, right? So I could have 5 features working at the same time with 5 AIs working on those features, and maybe still be able to pull someone's PR and fire up an environment, and all of these environments, running in parallel. So I got myself a Mac Studio at the time because I needed, some like a server to be able to run all of these Docker containers. And I would say since May, I've been really, not necessarily suffering, but like juggling with like 5 to 10 AI sessions in parallel in tmux. So tmux, for people who are not familiar, is just like a terminal, like a pane manager, like as PANE. So you can have like multiple tabs in your terminal. You can split the screen. So, so tmux works somewhat well, but you go kind of crazy quickly if you have like 5 environments working on 5 different ports and 5 tmux tabs, each one is split screen, and you're what I call session hopping, so you're going from an AI session to the next, trying to figure out which one has returned and what the heck you were doing in there. So Agor is a tool where you can essentially manage, the tool will manage your Git work trees for you. Maybe we'll start from the ground up. So first thing is you add your repos to Agor, and it's a super visual interface, right? So you get into this Agor interface, and the first thing you would do is bring in the Git repos you want to work with, and then it will manage your work trees for you. So you can say, I want to create a work tree to work on this specific feature. And then what happens is Agor is and people got to look at the website while listening to this because it's so rich visually. It's almost like a data visualization, tool in many ways. But Agor as a spatial first type of environment. So if you're familiar with Figma, is the idea of like you have a board and you have cards on this board. So this way, every time you create a new work tree, it's essentially a project that is represented as a card on a board. So because it's a board, it's a 2D landscape, right? Or it's a 2D layout. So you can start grouping some things inside your board. So you can say everything that's related to this project, I'm going to put in the top left corner. And then there's this notion of a zone. So a zone, think of it like a Kanban, right? Kanban being the vertical split of where different projects or issues or PRs are in your development lifecycle. So you can create these zones in Agor. They don't have to be vertical, right? They're just like blocks you put on your spatial canvas. And you might create, one for analysis, development, testing, ready for review. So you create your zones, and then you can move your cards in these zones. And these zones are set up in a way that you can use templated prompts against them. So every zone can have a prompt associated, and the prompt might be something like, look up at this GitHub issue template, with a template pointer that points to the URL, and do some deep analysis around it and propose a solution, file the design doc into a specific location if you want to, for it to work that way. So you drag and drop your card, it will get the issue URL, if you had put it as metadata on your work tree, and the agent gets to work. So then the agent's going to do a bunch of work. You see a little spinner on that card, and you go to the next card where you can fire up another session there. So it would really help to have visual support to talk about Agor, but I encourage people to just go see the website. It's at agor.live, and then you'll get a sense very quickly visually for what it looks like. But each card is a Git work tree on the board, and each card can have one or many AI sessions inside of it. Currently, when you click the little plus button to create a new AI session inside your work tree, you have the choice between Cloud Code, Codex, Gemini, or OpenCode.ai, which is an open source one that opens up, like 70 different models. So here you're in a environment where you can use all these AIs or all these agentic coding tools with the variety of models that they expose, and you can put some AI to work and kind of organize the work spatially so you really know what's happening there.
I think that's one of the interesting aspects where you're talking about having these templated prompts is that in my own experience of building these systems, I'm developing my own best practices for how I like to prompt these systems, how I like to structure the inputs, how I like to structure the guidance. But that is very difficult to then propagate and popularize throughout the rest of the team. I guess I could write markdown documents that I put in a repo, but people aren't necessarily going to read them or use them. And so I'm interested in how you're seeing that impact the ways that you're seeing your team converge on certain structures and best practices for how they think about what prompts to use for what types of use cases, how they segment up the work of the agents where you don't necessarily want to have it running too long because then it'll start to explode the context window and start forgetting things. And you also don't necessarily want to have it making changes that are too sweeping because then they're harder to review, and just how having that multiplayer canvas changes the ways that people are thinking about the scoping and structure of the work that they're having the agents do at the team level.
Yeah, good question. So when I started to build Agor, I was like, I want this to be fully multiplayer. So I went with, architectural decisions so that the app would be all WebSockets and all instantaneous. And so that we would have features like, a Slack-like interface on the left panel. So you can have a conversation, spatial annotations, a little bit like you have in Figma, where you can put drop a little pin with a comment and have a conversation there on the board itself, and a bunch of other social features. Like if you're two on the same board, or if you have 5 people on the same board, you'll see everyone's cursors moving around. So a little bit of eye candy, so you can see what everyone else is doing on the board. Now, I would say we're very much still in a phase where software development is still kind of or at least like local software development is like everyone's got their own process, right? And especially working with AI, I don't think teams have converged on any kind of workflow or prompts or structure to use, because every project is different, every repo is different, everyone develops their own technique in terms of like how they like to prompt the AI and how they like to categorize this stuff. The beauty in Agor is like you can really just define your own framework. It's an open canvas. You can define whatever zone you want and whatever prompts you want and whatever workflow you want. But I would say now Agor is still like an early experiment. So the project got open source like 2 weeks ago. We just started, having a shared box internally at Preset to unleash a bunch of people on the same boards. And we have to figure out, if those workflows and prompts are going to converge. I really think they will. But, until now, we just had no visibility into how other people were working with AI, right? Like I just have no visibility on your terminal. I have no idea what you're prompting. So now maybe it's the first opportunity for a lot of us to expose or open up how we work with AI. So very much an experiment. I think things will tend to converge. I think every project is different. And, we need a very open-ended framework like Agor for people to just define their zone and define, how they want to work with things. Something I wanted to mention that's kind of interesting too, I think is groundbreaking in many ways, is in Agor, so Agor manages your Docker environments or your development environments for you. So for each card, right? So every card is a work tree. If you set it up, if you give Agor an up-down app help, if you give it a set of templated commands to say, here's how you start my app, here's how you stop my app, here's the link to my app, and here's how you do a health check on my app. So once you configure your repo level to have these commands that are templated, you can start an environment by hitting the play button. So that's super useful, right? Because normally you would just run your Docker Compose up command, but then you have to manage the ports and all this stuff. So you got to make sure that it won't conflict. But once it is set up once for a repo, then anyone who's working on this Agor board can create a new work tree and start an environment. But the beauty is these dev environments now are live. So if the AI changes some code, then the app will change right away, right? You have your app in watch mode. And then that means that you can bring a PM or QA person or your code reviewer, and they can just hit up your live environment, They can see your AI sessions, right? So they could post prompt one of your session to say like, okay, can you change I'm looking at the app right now, the button color is not right. Can you just switch it to this particular color? So then you end up in a shared dev environment with all four AIs kind of ready to go on a live Git work tree and a live app. So that's, I think, something that's really groundbreaking. In my career, I haven't seen like shared dev environments in like ever, right? Like I think if you think about it, like, if you want to review some code and you got to pull the branch, you got to fire up your environment, and hopefully that stuff works. You might get tangled up and it might conflict with something. You have to stop this other Docker that was already running and start this new one. Now you have to switch branch. So now you can truly have like a shared development environment, and it's still unclear, how people are going to rally around that. So a bit of an experiment.
I'm interested in digging a bit more into, in particular, how you and your team are provisioning that environment, because being the creators and early adopters of this utility, I'm wondering how you're addressing some of those challenges of, do I just have one beefy EC2 server somewhere that has a lot of copies of Git somewhere? Are you digging into some of the GitHub code spaces? I know that there's the ONA project that used to be Gitpod that's leaning heavily into that agentic coding environments. Hugging Face is investing in agentic environments, though I think that that's a different use case where it's more for deployed agents. I'm just wondering how you're thinking about near term. What is the quick hack that you got running? And as you continue to invest in this and plan forward, what are some of the ways that you're thinking about how to actually make that shared developer environment something that is sustainable and maintainable over time?
Yeah, so first, I want to say we're kind of in the first inning, but in some ways, like at the bottom, the seventh too, because the project I wrote the first line of code like 6 weeks ago, and it has gotten so good so quickly, right? And I would kind of rate my productivity developing Agor as like maybe 50x pre-AI type of workflow. So we're pretty early on when it became something shareable that we could bring a handful of people on the same Agor instance. I use Codespaces. So Codespaces, for people who are not familiar, is just hosted by GitHub. It's essentially an EC2 instance with some GitHub hooks. It's pretty sweet. It works well. Actually, if you want to try Agor, there's a single click button that you can on Agor.live where it will create a GitHub Codespaces for you. And GitHub Codespaces, it's hosted by GitHub, and you can make the URL ports that come out public. So you can invite other people. It's kind of convenient. The Codespaces will pause themselves if no one's using them for a while, and they're really not meant for a group, right? So only one. I don't think there's a way to invite someone else inside your Codespaces. They're very, designed to be private, but then they expose public URLs. So you can serve an app and make that app public and shared. But we found like working with that just had some issues around state persistence, right? So the database was SQLite by default. Now I support Postgres. So less of an issue now, but like it feels like an ephemeral construct that's really private. So until I believe last week is when we set up a preset an EC2 instance, like a beefy EC2 instance to run Agor. And then we provisioned it, pretty aggressively so that it could run a lot of Docker, because that box is a shared dev box that we're going to have, a dozen or plus engineers hammering at very soon. So right now we're still super early. I shipped Postgres support last night. I merged a PR. So, we're still fairly early, but the vision is you crank out a big EC2 instance, you open it up to your team, probably behind VPN. We haven't talked about security. We probably shouldn't get too deep into that. But currently the Agor daemon is running as a, Agor user, a single user. So everything on that box becomes essentially shared across people. And then, people, once you have this instance running, there's some really good user settings in Agor. So if you go into your own user settings, you can set your own API keys for your coding tools and your own preference. So there's pretty rich, I would say there's like 6 or 7 tabs in the user settings where you can define your API keys, your codecs home if you want, tons of feature, your audio settings so that the task will chime at you when the session returns. So super rich features here. And I would say the whole like multiplayer, multi-agent. So the multi-agent I've used a lot. So I'll put like 12 agents in parallel, a mix of Codex and Claude Code, mostly some Gemini, but so multi-agent works awesomely well. It's super great. So single player Agor is fantastic. That's part of the reason why I was able to build it in such little time. I built like an app with a lot of product surface very quickly. So it works extremely well. The multiplayer stuff, we have yet to see how it's going to work out. What happens when you invite a QA person to come see the live app? That's essentially your dev environment, and let them, prompt against it. So that's pretty interesting to see what's going to emerge here.
Are you tired of data migrations that drag on for months or even years? What if I told you there's a way to cut that timeline by up to a factor of 6 while guaranteeing accuracy? Datafold's Migration Agent is the only AI-powered solution that doesn't just translate your code, it validates every single data point to ensure a perfect parity between your old and new systems. Whether you're moving from Oracle to Snowflake, migrating stored procedures to dbt, or handling complex multi-system migrations, they deliver production-ready code with a guaranteed timeline and fixed price. Stop burning budget on endless consulting hours. Visit dataengineeringpodcast.com/Datafold to book a demo and see how they turn months-long migration nightmares into week-long success stories. Another interesting shift that I can anticipate when you have that agentic session being long-running and multi-user, where it's not just one person prompting, giving feedback, steering the agent until you decide that it's done and then shutting it down. It leaves it open for you to maybe start with something and say, this is something that I am speculating on. I think it might be useful. You get an initial set of changes done, and then you can actually hand it off to the next person, where maybe you're doing some exploration of a potential feature, and then you hand it off to your product manager, who's going to have more opinions on how it should be run. And then they can then hand it off to the QA person to say, hey, this looks like it does all the things that I want. Now I need you to make sure that it's actually going to do what it needs to do. And they can just take over that session to add in the appropriate fixes, and then you can say, okay, this has gone through all the cycles, it's ready for actually doing the code review, rather than making some changes, doing the code review, doing a test deploy, getting feedback, saying, oh no, you actually need to redo it, and just adding a lot of the extra cycles, versus being able to actually hand off that work to other people who have different perspectives and different views on the overall problem space.
Yeah, I think that's where software engineering is going in many ways, like orchestrating a lot of agents and then bringing people to rally and work together on a shared environment. And so Agor certainly allows for these kinds of workflow, and we have yet to see how it's going to manifest itself. I think the idea of a handoff is good. Git branches have been so private forever. When you think about it, your Git branch, it's like, would you let someone else access to your file system and mess with your branch and commit in your branch? No, it's private, right? So I think in a lot of ways, people might not be ready for this. And there's some question of like, what happens when someone else is prompting your session? So formalizing the idea of like, this is a private work tree, like this is my branch, no one else can prompt in it. So I've been designing some RBAC solutions. So you can say, this work tree is private. I'm the only owner of it. Or I trust someone. I want to bring them as an owner of this work tree, right? So they can prompt my session, they can change the Git state. And so I think these controls are vital. And then, for the rest of the people, are they visible to others or private? They can't even see that you have a work tree. So I'm baking that in the framework right now so that you can define how you want to work with others and have some gatekeeping of like, I don't want anyone else to prompt this work tree. I didn't talk too much about this, but there's because we're not in a CLI. So if you've been living in Claude Code or Codex like I have, CLI, they're pretty sweet CLIs. They've done wonders in terms of like UX of what you can do inside CLI, but there's still CLIs, right? So here in Agor, like visually is much more clear. So there's a bunch of features like showing you your context window as a progress bar. So it's very self-evident, very visual, a lot of information about how much every prompt costed in terms of tokens and dollars. So you get all this visual feedback with rich tooltips and all of that. So that's super valuable. Another thing that's really valuable is we capture the Git transition. So for every prompt that you do, you have like a collapsible bar. So usually just look at the latest one. But in that little prompt header, you'll see what was the Git before and after this prompt. So what was the Git SHA? So we'll say you're on this SHA and it's dirty, and if the agent does a commit, you'll see the Git transition. So you can, at all point in time, as metadata, go see like, hey, when the QA person prompted this, what was the Git SHA at the time? And I want to revert to that point. So point being, like a really highly visual interface to your AI session is really, really useful. We also capture, all that metadata so you can do analysis on it. There's some features that are pretty cool around, running some leaderboards, who burned the most tokens, what are the worktrees that took the most, cost the most money or burned the most tokens. So we capture all this metadata, so the half-life of a session is, longer in Agor. But yeah, so as to like how people are going to work around it, I think it's like largely to be discovered. I think we're in a new space, like in terms of like being able to share dev environments, AI session. You think how much we've been working with AI over the past like 6 to 9 months, and then I've never seen any other software engineers like AI session. Like I don't know how they prompt, right? Like it's completely opaque to me. So like Agor kind of casts a light. You can go see other people's prompting style, right? You might run an agent to say, do an analysis, compare my prompting style with this other software engineer who's not saying they're getting 10x acceleration. Like let's try to identify the patterns. So doing statistics, metadata analysis becomes possible instead of having these super ephemeral sessions. Wanted to bring up like another feature I think is super groundbreaking. So I said earlier, it's hard to talk about Agor because there's so much to it, right? There's a spatial canvas, there's a super rich interface to AI conversation, there's a multiplayer option and its impact. But the one thing I haven't talked about, I think that's super groundbreaking, is the Agor as an internal MCP server about itself. So every agent that you start inside Agor has access to the Agor system through the Agor internal MCP. So what does that mean? So that means that any agent that you fire up can go see what another agent is doing, or can go prompt another agent. There's also a scheduler inside Agor. So that means like you could say every hour, I want an agent to wake up and go see what all the other agents are doing. And based on what it finds, do some prompting or move some Git worktrees to a different zone if they're ready to be pushed. Or you can schedule an agent. So because the agents have access to Agor, you can tell your agent, hey, can you fire up my Docker environment and look at the logs? And then it will use the MCP start environment for the work tree, and then it will call the MCP check logs for that environment. And it's like, oh, the environment did not boot up because there's a TypeScript compilation error. Let me go fix that. Okay, let me restart the environment now. So the agents are Agor aware in Agor. So that means that they can do pretty much anything, right? An example of that is when I invited my team, I took the DL, just the email addresses for, I went in Gmail and then just got a list of email as CSV, then pasted that in Agor session, say, can you create one Agor user for each one of these emails, give this password, make them all admins. And then Agor just went and created the 12 users, So sky's the limit there in terms of what you can do. Agor's got deep support for MCP, so you can just put your MCP configuration in one place. Only Codex, I couldn't wire out the SDK to work with MCP, but Gemini and Claude Code have full access to MCP. So if you want to have a Slack MCP or a Airflow MCP, you set it once and it should work with all of your agents. So that means you could have an agent that says, hey, every week, go look at all the Agor, chat session, produce a leaderboard of like who burned the most token and post on Slack. So you put that on a schedule. So very meta. I don't think it's been done before, right? Basically agents being connected to agents connected to agents, yes, but like agent orchestration where each agent can go and use the system, use the framework to do some pretty intricate things. I'll have just another example of that. Something I did recently, I prompted an agent to say, hey, go look at the superset repository that I work on. Look at the past week or so of GitHub issues, and let's identify, a dozen or so GitHub issues that are good for us to work on, to push forward. And once you do that, let's curate the list. And then we identified, say, 5 or 6 issues I wanted to work on. And I say, can you create a Git work tree for each one of these? So I asked for that. I saw 6 cards land on my board, with the GitHub issue URL attached as metadata. So I get my 6 new cards, and then I just drag and drop them all into my analyze the this GitHub issue zone. And then all 6 agents, got to work, and they started, retrieving the GitHub issue, parsing it, looking at it against the code, and ultimately producing an analysis of the issue. And then my next zone after that is, okay, I like your design doc, let's go and start coding this up. So I could just drag my cards and all the work, gets done just with a little bit of drag and drop. Something interesting is I could have just gotten another agent to say, look at these 6 cards, on this board, evaluate whether they're ready to be dropped to the next zone, and just move them to the start coding zone and fire up the prompt, right? So there's this all like agent automation that's emerging that is possible because of Agor's internal MCP server. So to put it all together, it's like quite a few super groundbreaking, features, right? So the internal MCP, the spatial layout, the multiplayer stuff, the managed shared dev environments, I think it has really the potential to like reshape or define how we do, software engineering through agent orchestration over the next, 6 months, 12 months, until like agents take over the world, maybe.
And as you've been building this system and introducing your team to it and seeing how it shifts your own practices and your team practices, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you learned in that process?
So we're fairly early there, right? Open source 2 weeks ago. I'm still personally like reorganizing my workflow around these groundbreaking, new set of features and capabilities. So my workflow has become a lot more parallel. Now it's really hard to change the way that people's workflow, like people, it takes a moment for people to develop new workflows. So I would say we're tiptoeing. The rest of the team just got introduced to Agor, a few weeks ago. Some have played with it. I'm getting good feedback. You got to set up the system. So I think a few people really started defining their zones and defining their work trees and, reorganizing their workflow, but we're still fairly early. The tool is like so much more mature than I thought it would be at this point. Lots of product surface, first line of code written 6 weeks ago. The app is just so slick and works so well. I think it has been transformative for me. Now I got to push people. Part of the reason I come on the podcast is like, I built this thing. It's amazing. Like now people need to hear about it and play with it. And it's going to take a moment, I think, for really people to reshape their workflow and start transitioning to be using this primarily.
And are there any cases from your early experimentation where you would advise against adopting Agor or advise using some other agentic scaffolding for it?
Yeah, so I would say the main thing for the multiplayer, some of the areas where I'm like, be cautious, is the fact that everything runs as a daemon currently. So there's no Unix level isolation. So that means that, if you work in Agor, there's a nice little terminal, in browser terminal you can fire up and use tmux behind the scene, but you have to essentially trust the people that you share the box with as if they were on that box, with sudo access pretty much. So I think there's some security stuff I'm sorting out around making sure each user gets a unique user. If you decide to run in multiplayer mode and you decide to enable the Unix OS level isolation, that there will be a way so that everyone gets their home and no one can look at your SSH keys or your API keys. So currently the security stuff, I tell people like, it's as if you would invite someone on your laptop and they have full access to your file system. And there's agents in there too that effectively run as the Agor user and could nuke and break stuff too. Until recently was working only on SQLite, so you might lose the state. So, it's fairly early, and I think the security stuff, we got to sort out. But to some extent, if you're going to have a development environment, and a box shared with others, there's always some risk, right? There's nothing that says that your agent's going to check. Your agent might just say, I'm going to check to see if your GitHub token, environment variable is here, and it runs an echo GitHub token, and that goes into the Agor database, as a response message. So I would say the area where I would advise to be cautious is around multiplayer and like bring only people you trust, to the box that you set up for it. There's going to be some work there too. So thinking about, getting that Unix level isolation security, but still becomes, in many ways, a breeding ground for things to get uncontained or for secrets to get open to other people potentially.
Are there any other aspects of the work that you're doing on Agor, the ways that it's changing your own workflows, or how you're thinking about this multi-agent, multiplayer setup that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Yeah, so the meta stuff was kind of a discovery along the way, right? So early on, I was like, hey, it'd be cool if Agor exposed this MCP Agor service to itself. So it can be used internally, but externally too. So since I've had that, I added a lot of MCP tools, right? So get the list of session, get the list of work trees, inspect a session, fire up an environment, look at the logs for an environment, create a user. I added a leaderboard service, so you can get the sum of tokens burned, by work tree or by user. But the whole agents orchestrating agent, or the agent to agent cross communication, is completely new to me, and I'm just starting to do some cool stuff with that. It opens so many doors. So recently I added a queuing mechanism for prompts. So until recently, you couldn't prompt an agent that was busy, but now we have a queuing system. So you can, at any point in time, an agent can put a prompt for another agent and we'll just get queued up. So that opens so many possibilities that I don't know how people are going to use this stuff, right? Like there's this idea of chain reaction of agents. If you ask an agent to fire up another agent who fires up 3 agent, and there's potential issues with chain reaction and kind of explosion of agents. I'm realizing now I'm going to need policies like never more than 12 agents on this board or something like that, because who knows what's going to happen there. Another thing I didn't talk about that I think is really interesting is session trees. So inside the CLI, I don't know if people have discovered that in the wild, but if you've been using Cloud Code, you probably discovered the -- resume CLI function. So when you fire up Cloud Code, you can say Cloud -- resume and it will show your session. There's also a -- fork. So you can fork sessions. And what does that mean? What does that fork? So when you fork a Cloud Code session or a Codex session, it basically takes the context window, but forks the context window. So I added some primitives in Agor. So when you prompt an agent, you can always fork the session, which is really interesting. So that allows you to manage your context window better. So say if you're you want to ask the agent to compile a report of everything that's been done so far, you can fork the session. It will burn some context in that new session without polluting that main session. So that's a pretty cool feature that I'm starting to figure out how to use more. I found some use cases for it. So call it forking sessions, which forks the context window. And then recently I added spawning subsessions. So the power users of Cloud Code have figured out the task tool or the sub-agent workflow, right? So the sub-agent workflow is when you ask your main agent to fire up another agent to do a task. And then that runs inside its own context window with its own fresh context window from scratch, right? So the parent agent prepares a prompt for the sub-agent, and then there's an event loop, or the parent agent will wait for the sub-agent to be done and get a report and then keep going. So I added much better support for this inside Agor so that you can ask your agent now so say if you have a Claude session, you can say fire up a codex, spawn a subsession for codex and for Gemini to review this code. So what you'll see is your session breaking into a tree, right? So your session inside your card going to break into 2 child sessions, and you'll see a Gemini session, a codex session, and when they're done, they will call back the parent agent to say, I'm done reviewing the code, here's my report. So here there's this multi-agent spawning tasks in parallel that's extremely powerful, a little bit dangerous just in terms of agents run away or context management. At some point you're okay, what do I have going on here? But one thing I've used it for is define a way to refactor a specific JavaScript to TypeScript migration. on a single file. So really define how to do that. And then asking my agents to spawn 10 subsession to process 10 files in parallel. So then, you see new sessions pop into existence, do some work, report back to the parent agent. And then what's cool compared to the task tool for people familiar with Claude Code specifically is the session remains after it's done. So you can still go into, say, the subsession that process a certain file and say like, you can post prompt the session, or you can fork that session, or you could spawn another subsession from there. So crazy stuff around, like, call it session trees with forking and spawning subsession. Still don't I have some use cases for it, but curious to see how the world's going to take advantage of these primitives in the wild, because it really opens up some crazy potential workflows.
Definitely very interesting and unpredictable world that we're in these days. So for anybody who wants to follow along with the work that you're doing on Agor and experiment with that, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And yeah, appreciate you taking the time today to join me and share your explorations and experiments with this exciting new space and some of the ways that you're using it to accelerate your own work and your team's work. So definitely look forward to digging into it further myself, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Yeah, I highly encourage people to check out Agor Live. The docs are really good. So somehow I got, agents to write really good docs with rich screenshots, some GIFs, and it's super, super easy to install. So, npm i-g agor-live. It's a single command. You could have it run it on your laptop in the next minute if you want to, right? So it's really easy to fire up, and I think it's like you assume that open source, like an open source GUI, is going to be a little rough around the edges. Like, this thing is slick, it's snappy, it works super well. It's so feature rich, and visually too, it's so much better than using a CLI. So even if all you want to do is just use it to run your Cloud Code or Codex session, you get a lot of benefits. And then worktree management and environment management, something you can grow into. So you can, you don't have to have the problem of, I want to orchestrate 20 agents. If you just want to have a little bit more recall and a little bit more control over your AI sessions, super easy to use, super easy to fire up, and pretty slick, awesome application.
All right. Well, thanks again for putting in that work, and have a good rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening, and don't forget to check out our other shows. Podcast.net covers the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And the AI Engineering Podcast is your guide to the fast-moving world of building AI systems. Visit the site to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story.
And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends and coworkers.